6 years after their debut film, Studio Ponoc finally releases their second feature film, The Imaginary. Studio Ponoc is still relatively new to the anime industry, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with them, Studio Ponoc was formed back in 2015 by former employees of Studio Ghibli. A couple years later, they released their first feature film, Mary and the Witch's Flower, directed by Hiromasa Yonebayashi, who is known for films such as When Marnie Was There and The Secret World of Ariete. I saw Mary and the Witch's Flower back when it was released, and personally, I thought it was okay. It looked a lot like a Ghibli film, given that it was made by former Ghibli employees, but it didn't feel like one. I never really felt amazed or captivated by the film, but I thought at the very least it was a good starting point for the newly formed studio. But who knows, I've only seen the film once, so maybe if I watch it again, I'll feel differently. Studio Ponoc would then release an anthology film shortly after, which again I thought was okay. My personal favorite of the anthology was the last film about the Invisible Man. But anyways, back to the topic at hand. The Imaginary was released in Japan on December 15th, 2023, and on US Netflix on July 5th, 2024. It was directed by Ghibli alum Yoshiyuki Momose, being his first feature film for Studio Ponoc. It follows an imaginary friend named Roger as he discovers the town of the Imaginaries, but also faces the looming threat of Mr. Bunting, a sinister man who has an unsettling interest in imaginaries. Right off the bat, this is Studio Ponoc's best looking film, which, I mean, it doesn't have a lot of competition, but still, it looks great. Everything is so detailed and colorful. I was honestly amazed by the amount of effort that went into the art of this film. It feels like each frame is a fully rendered art piece. Personally, I like how Mary and the Witch's Flower looked over this film, since I am more into, for the lack of a better word, simplistic art styles. But I can recognize that this film probably had more work put into it to achieve the style that it did. It sort of leans into looking like a storybook, but not as much as other films that also do this effect. It makes sense for it, since it was based off a book. The animation is quite intricate as well. Characters are constantly moving even for the littlest of gestures, and it makes them feel more alive and human. It definitely adds to the emotions of the characters during big or important scenes. I thought that the story did take a bit to kick off and had me worrying if this was going to be another average film by Ponoc. But fortunately, it started picking up after the first act concluded. The film then started diving into pretty deep and emotional topics that I wasn't really expecting out of it. One theme that I really enjoyed being explored was how a lot of the imaginary characters were conceived. While some imaginaries were obviously conjured up by children wanting to play in their imaginations, others were brought up to help cope with the trauma that a kid may be going through at the time. One character was imagined because his kid was brought up in a bad environment and was afraid to go to sleep. Thus, he created his imaginary to look out for him when he was asleep. Another character's kid was sick with what I believe was cancer, so she was imagined to keep her kid company while she was in the hospital. These backstories add a lot to the characters' traits as they were conceived for certain purposes. For example, the imaginary who was created to look after his kid, he does not sleep as he was supposed to look after his kid when he was asleep. Although imaginaries face the threat of being forgotten, which can happen if their kid grows out of needing them or dies. If they are forgotten, they disappear forever. Luckily, there is a safe haven for friendless imaginaries called the Town of the Imaginaries, located in some library somewhere. There, they can continue to exist and be a kid's imaginary for a day whenever they like. This aspect of the film reminded me of Toy Story 3 and Coco, as those characters had similar dilemmas. So while that aspect does feel a little uninspired, I think it still works here. The main villain, Mr. Bunting, was also quite menacing, which is good. You want your villain to create conflict. But I was more intrigued by his imaginary, whose name I forgot. Did they say her name? Oh, I don't remember. She's a little girl who kind of resembles Wednesday Addams, but a lot scarier. I was actually kind of spooked the first time she appeared on screen. Anyway, I was curious about what she thought of Mr. Bunting's actions, as what he did was against her own kind. Perhaps she thought if she did anything, she ran the risk of being thrown out and forgotten, which I guess makes sense, but I wish we got more of an explanation of why she put up with him and got to know her a little more. The last 10 or 20 minutes did feel a little weird. To me, it felt like a couple of things happened because they needed to happen, but nothing egregious story-wise, so I think it could be overlooked. I ended up still liking the ending and had a great time with the film. After seeing this film, it made me realize that while it looked similar to a Ghibli movie, it felt even less like a Ghibli movie compared to Mary and the Witch's Flower, which is probably a good thing. I think that's what hurt Mary and the Witch's Flower for me, since I was sort of expecting a Ghibli experience but didn't get that. Yet the thing with Mary and the Witch's Flower is, it felt like it was trying to emulate what a Ghibli film was and fell flat. The Imaginary, on the other hand, did its own thing and was successful at it. Halfway through the film, I started to think to myself, you know what? This does feel different, but in a good way. And maybe I should start going to new Ponoc films, not expecting a Ghibli experience. I think this is what Studio Ponoc needs to continue doing in order to distinguish themselves from Studio Ghibli. Also, their art style is starting to look a little different, but you can still see the Ghibli roots. Maybe if they start pushing a little more to a different art style, then they're gonna one day stop being associated with them. And now that I think about it, it's probably why all those Ghibli employees left to form this studio, to do things they probably didn't have the freedom to do at Ghibli. Anyways, I was pleasantly surprised by The Imaginary and expect great things in the future from Studio Ponoc. The movie is currently on Netflix right now, so it's very accessible if you want to watch it, and I highly recommend it for Ghibli fans, since it is a breath of fresh air with a hint of familiarity. Okay, bye.